Hey, this is chapter 26 about World War II. So, the world headed towards World War II. The beginning of World War II is directly linked to the end of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, that we talked about in the last chapter, punished Germany, made Germany's economic recovery exponentially more difficult. As Germany suffered and its people became desperate, Germany became a more likely setting for political extremism. Germany itself saw undeclared civil war between communist, socialist forces and fascist right-wing forces. As the economy became worse, the popularity of those two left and right extremes increased. During times when things stabilized, you saw a movement towards a more moderate centrism. Now, in this period of extreme desperation, and in Germany it was worse than the Great Depression in the United States, there was an intense resentment over that Treaty of Versailles. What's going to emerge from this situation is a jingoist, German supremacist, war-loving political group, and they'll win control of Germany. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, and if you're curious where that word comes from, it's not an acronym. Nazi is just the first two syllables of the German word for that party, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartie. National, so Nazi. Otherwise, it's a mouthful. And on the other side of the world, Asia, Japan, and the United States were increasingly clashing over their interests in the Pacific Ocean. And so as the world heads for war in the late 1930s, the United States, again, will remain largely neutral. Though Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, he believed that the United States should join the Allies, but eventually the decision is made for them when Japan launches a surprise attack in Hawaii, and then Germany will follow up by declaring war on the United States a few days later. That situation makes it much easier for the United States to join the war. United States and Japan. So the United States had extensive interests in the Pacific Ocean and in East Asia. We've already talked about how the United States was very much involved with trade in China. The United States had part of its overseas empire in Philippines, other islands in the Pacific, Guam, Midway, Wake Island, the Solomon Islands. There are many overseas possessions in the Pacific Ocean that the United States either outright owns or has invested a lot of resources into and has economic interests in. So it was against American interests when China found itself in the middle of a chaotic civil war in the late 20s and 1930s, and it was also against American interests that Japan was increasingly imperialistic itself and very expansionist. Japan had annexed Korea in 1910, and in 1931 invaded and annexed Manchuria, which is the northeastern part of China, north of Korea. The international reaction to Japanese behavior is condemnation. The League of Nations, which is the forerunner to the United Nations, issue a rebuke of Japan for its behavior in Manchuria, along with human rights abuses that were occurring. And Japan will withdraw from the organization in 1933. They'll claim that the Western world is being hypocritical, that it was totally fine to take over other countries and commit atrocities whenever Britain and France and to a lesser extent and a little bit later the United States were doing it. But now that Asians are doing it, it's not okay. That was one of the big arguments from Japan. Either way, the war in China was absolutely horrific and did involve widespread crimes against humanity, intentional murdering of civilians on a massive scale, torturing, very brutal situation. Now, at this point in Japanese history, though they were still technically under an emperor, real control rested with the military. So it was a military dictatorship. Japan had shown itself to be an aggressive, expansionist empire. The next section, war clouds over Europe again. Now, most of Europe was horrified at the prospect of another war. Europeans looked at a war with dread and fear instead of that giddy excitement that they had before World War I. So in other words, Europeans were extremely naive about World War I, or I should say they were extremely naive about the prospect of war before World War I. There were no illusions in Europe at this point. War clearly was the worst case scenario. When people talk about appeasement, which we'll discuss a little bit later, appeasement being allowing an aggressive country to get away with it, it's more understandable if you know the context of the situation. Again, War is what destroyed such a huge percentage of people's lives in France, in Britain, and across Europe. It wasn't the ideals. It wasn't the pride. It wasn't anything other than steel meeting flesh because of a massive war that could have been avoided. So without even taking the specifics of World War II and Nazism, what was going on before World War II, without even analyzing those and talking about justification, it's important to know that regardless of all of that, there was an absolute paralyzing fear of war just as things seemed to be maybe getting a little bit better in Europe. The German perspective was different. They were humiliated by the end of World War I. A lot of Germans had come to believe that they were cheated. Many Germans were sort of told by the military establishment that, well, Germany could have still won the war militarily. They didn't have to quit, but it was really civilian leadership that betrayed them, too quickly sought an armistice on very bad terms for Germany. So because of that, a lot of Germans are going to feel like their lesson isn't that they shouldn't start a war, it's that they shouldn't trust civilian leadership quite as much. Now, again, there's going to be a lot of people after World War I who do not have that perspective, but there will be millions of Germans that do. So before the Nazis consolidated power and set up a fascist government in Germany, there was a republic. It's called the Weimar Republic. It struggled immensely to maintain support of the German people. It was balancing between making the people happy and keeping the military establishment happy, because in Germany, all the way back before World War I, the military establishment was very, very important to Germany. They were very influential, they were very politically connected. It was absolutely what you would consider a militarist country. So when outside powers like the United States and Britain and France installed a new government that was supposed to seem more like a republic based on American or British or French tradition, that government in Germany faced hostility that did not exist in Britain, the United States, and France. Like I said, the military establishment in Germany had spread the lie that the only reason Germany lost was because they were stabbed in the back by the civilian government. In fact, that will be a very useful phrase for the Nazis as they gain power and convince Germans to support them. Stabbed in the back. Of course, their particular version of stabbed in the back focused mostly on Jews within the government, because the Nazi Party was a very racial-based party. But even before that or without that, there was still this attitude, even those who may not apply it specifically to a certain racial group like Jews, that the military had been cheated. And this was absolutely not true. This was false, if I haven't said that yet. It was a perception based on lies. Many Germans ended up believing falsely that their armies had actually done quite well, and only because of liberal weakness that the army had been tricked into signing a very humiliating treaty. Now, like I said, suffering will skyrocket due to the economic turmoil that we've already discussed. People became desperate in Germany, turned to those radical parties, communists and fascists. Germans were attracted to the idea of a powerful nationalist government, and once Germany seemingly miraculously pulled itself out of their economic depression, many people are going to fall in love with it. It's a situation where there are millions of Germans who think that Hitler is a distasteful character. They think that, maybe he's ignorant, or that he's maybe putting on a show that's not really how he would be as a leader. Because of the apparent economic success, a lot of maybe otherwise moderates who aren't primarily attracted in white supremacy or some of the other more radical ideas from the Nazi Party, they were okay enough with it. An update on the United States and the Western Hemisphere. If you remember when we talked about imperialism, the United States had developed a really bad reputation in the Western Hemisphere, that is Central and South America. By the 1920s and the 1930s, the relationship was bad. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States periodically intervened militarily in Latin American nations to protect its own interests, its own being the United States. And this happened always when there were commercial interests of the United States at stake. It was packaged many times as trying to help people, trying to restore order, but it was quite obvious to nearly everyone that, what was going on is the justifications were convenient so that American business interests can be protected at the expense of whatever country the United States was intervening in. And again, this happened not one or two times. This was a very common occurrence. It was either always happening or right around the corner from happening again. So after the Roosevelt Corollary of 1904, whenever the United States felt its debts were not being repaid in a prompt fashion, its citizens' business interests were being threatened maybe, or its access to natural resources were being impeded, military intervention from the United States or threats from the United States were often used to coerce whatever Latin American country into compliance. So this made many Latin Americans wary of U.S. presence in their region. And of course, hostilities are going to grow towards the United States. So by the 1930s, the United States finally decided, because its reputation was so awful, that it was time to back off a bit. Of course, it was easier for the United States to do this because American business interests in the 1930s had been so thoroughly established, and the United States was so overwhelmingly powerful in the region that it was much easier for the United States to play nice but still retain nearly all of its economic advantages. The dirty work had to be done to sort of establish the dominance, but once the dominance is in place, it's much easier to do PR or damage control for your reputation. Either way, the United States decided to initiate what it called, and what FDR called, the good neighbor policy. The Americans claimed at this point that no country, including itself, should, and this is a quote, have the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. And so while the United States continued to have massive economic influence in the region, the small wars, the direct political meddling, for the most part, went away for a while. Now I can tell you the United States still has an immense influence over the region and is still very much involved militarily, mostly behind the scenes. Venezuela is the most obvious example right now. Okay, so we talked about American isolationism, which again is a problematic term. We talked about American neutrality, which is not. Well, that is a problematic term too, I guess. Anyway, all terms are problematic probably. American attitudes about the war. Okay, we covered that in World War I. It's a slightly different story in World War II. So as we talked about, there's different levels of neutrality. Some, again, called for the United States to treat all nations equally, like literally. Others called for slightly favoring the democracies, but not directly assisting their war industries. Still others wanted to help the Allies with supplies and money, but not send troops. So you can see there's different levels of participation, or lack thereof. Now, in 1935, and the United States is going to get involved in December of 1941. I say get involved, declare war. That's when Pearl Harbor happens, 1941. So 6 years before that, 1935, the United States passed the Neutrality Act, and that prohibited the sale of arms to all belligerents in a time of war. Remember, belligerent is country involved in a war. But American companies who sold other items needed for the war, like steel, oil, copper, they could still easily get around this. And I don't mean illegally. It was still legal for American companies to do business. And so, to give one specific example, whenever fascist Italy under Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in Africa, and there was international condemnation over this, American companies still sold to the Italians. Italy easily annexed Ethiopia. So through a series of neutrality acts, the United States inched towards full participation with the Allies. So Germany, Italy, and Japan are eventually going to be known as the Axis powers. Road to war. By the late 1930s, war seemed inevitable to many in Europe. There was still a strong hope to avoid it, and this is where appeasement comes in. But at this point, the United States version of neutrality was clearly headed towards full participation. It really felt like it was only a matter of time. Again, FDR very heavily preferred for the United States to get involved in the war, but he couldn't, being the amazing politician he was, he couldn't just go against overwhelming public opinion. And because of this, you have a lot of, I hate to use the term conspiracy theories, but, the government did issue reports about how maybe to cause Japan to lash out against the United States. As far as I'm aware, there's no direct evidence that FDR wanted a Pearl Harbor to happen. So I'm not saying that, to be clear. However, we do know for a fact that there were reports that were submitted to the White House, to the military leadership, relationship that explained certain actions that could be taken by the United States that would make it more likely for Japan to attack the United States. And just to be specific, what I'm referring to is known as the McCollum Memo, McCollum. It's also known as the 8-Action Memo. And I'm just going to read you Wikipedia, what it says about it. And it is a real thing. I didn't learn this from Wikipedia. I'm just using this for convenience. It was a memorandum dated October 7th, 1940, which is more than a year before Pearl Harbor. It was sent by a lieutenant commander who and here's a quote, provided the president with intelligence reports on Japan and oversaw every intercepted and decoded Japanese military and diplomatic report destined for the White House. So what we know is the plan had 8 steps. The first one, make an arrangement with Britain for the use of British bases in the Pacific, particularly Singapore, make an arrangement with the Netherlands for the use of base facilities and acquisitions of supplies in the Dutch East Indies. These were colonies by the Dutch that the Japanese coveted for natural resources like oil. 3, give all possible aid to the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. That's the nationalist Chinese who were involved in a civil war, but also a war of survival against Japan, who will eventually flee China after losing the civil war and become Taiwan, which we'll get into that later. 4, send a division of long-range heavy cruisers to the Philippines, Singapore maybe. Send 2 divisions of submarines there. That's number 5. 6, keep the main strength of the U.S. fleet in the Pacific in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. 7, insist that the Dutch refuse to grant Japanese demands for undue economic concessions, particularly oil. 8, completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. Well, what was the point of all those things? Well, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be fully prepared to accept the threat of war, a plan to get Japan to commit an act of war. Again, that's not proof that there was a conspiracy from the top to manipulate Japan into declaring war, but we do know that there was a report about how to do that, and it involved oil embargo, it involved a lot of specifics. So I encourage everyone to look into the McCollum Memo themselves. Again, that's always my approach to history, is let you know what's out there, let you be the judge of it, don't rely on me or any other one source, be curious. Regardless of all of that, Japan did continue to commit atrocities in China, and Germany continued to bully its neighbors in Europe with no real consequences. The beginning of World War II is probably Japan in Manchuria, but because history tends to be Eurocentric, a lot of times Germany's invasion of Poland is considered the first act of World War II. Germany's main thing is that Germans should live in Germany, and that things that were done at the end of World War I that carved land where Germans lived out of Germany and they were living somewhere else, that was an injustice that needed to be fixed. And so whether it was Poland or Czechoslovakia or Austria or France or Denmark, wherever it was that had a sizable population of people who would identify ethnically as German, they were under the microscope from Germany's perspective. Poland has existed long before World War II, but as a modern state, Poland did not exist at the beginning of World War I. It was created by carving land out of Germany and carving land out of Russia, the Russian Empire. It's not totally new, but in terms of a modern country, Poland was created or recreated after World War I. Anyway, there were lots of ethnic Germans that lived in parts of Poland. There was a city, Danzig, that used to be part of Germany. Poland, the way the borders were set up, actually cut off a chunk of Germany, which used to be Prussia. Anyway, the point is that Germany felt that they had a very strong justification for getting their land back. But what's going to happen is Germany's going to invade Poland and conquer the whole thing very, very quickly. It shocks the world, really. Then they turn around, they invade Denmark, they invade Norway. Germany conquers Denmark and Norway, which is, again, shocking. But the real shock didn't come until spring of 1940. Germany, like they did in World War I, they invade France through Belgium and the Netherlands and through Luxembourg. And I know that Germany didn't invade the Netherlands in World War I, they invaded through Belgium. But anyway, but this time France is totally overrun. France will surrender. And Britain barely hangs on in the Battle of Britain. Germany tries to invade Britain, but they can't because of the English Channel, the water in between mainland Europe and Britain. Germany tried to, they wanted to, but they had to gain air supremacy in order to feel comfortable putting their army in ships, because when an army is in ships, it's very vulnerable. Germany lost the Battle of Britain, so they couldn't invade Britain. Now, as a very real fear, though, that Europe may be completely overrun. Now, with all that going on, the United States did not get involved. Even when Britain had a knife at its throat, as John Wayne says in The Longest Day, most Americans didn't want to get involved in the war. Now, FDR did, and he was pushing for it, but there was only so much he could do, which again is where that whole controversy about the memo and did the leadership want the United States to get attacked so that American public would totally change their opinion about the war. Again, don't know if that happened, but it's worth looking into. For the election of 1940, both Republican and Democrats campaigned on helping the Allies but staying out of the war. And this is going to remain the plan politically until Pearl Harbor. So you hear Lend-Lease program, that's what it's, the era of Lend-Lease is when the United States was definitely favoring Britain, but the United States hadn't decided to actually declare war or get involved. And so the Lend-Lease bill was January 10th, 1941, and the Lend-Lease bill authorized the president to sell, lend, or lease arms, weapons, and any other equipment and supplies to, quote, any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States, end quote. By mid-1941, Hitler and his allies stood in control of the entire continent of Europe. Then, to the shock of the world, on June 22nd, 1941, Germany decided to invade the Soviet Union. Probably the person who least expected this was Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. In fact, he was in denial. He threatened to execute people who kept telling him, hey, we have top secret information that the Germans are going to invade on this date. Here's their plan. And then Stalin was so convinced that that wouldn't happen that he ignored it. And like I said, threatened to kill the people who kept telling him top secret, good spy information. So once believed an impossible feat, by December of 1941, Germany stood at the gates of Moscow, and most of the world believed that it was only a matter of weeks or maybe even days that the Soviet Union would capitulate, would give up. And if that had happened, there is no telling what the world would look like today. We don't know that how close they were to giving up. We don't even know for sure if the Germans had captured Moscow, which they didn't ever, if that would have represented the end for the Soviet Union. But the world thought so at the time, and very well could have been right. If the Soviet Union fell into German hands, Germany may have actually been able to conquer all of Europe and win the war, whatever that. Now, many Americans who advocated for the United States to join the war did so because they thought Nazi Germany threatened the freedom of the entire world. So unlike World War I, no one ever thought that Germany was going to try to conquer the whole world in World War I. But it was looking that way in World War II. Very different scenario. Let's talk about the Pacific now. Japan saw how Western powers had conducted themselves over the last couple hundred years. They saw how European powers would take colonies and establish like a sphere of influence here or there. Japan thought that it should be the natural leader of Asia. So they were all about that whole colonialism thing. They just thought that Asia should be colonized by Asians, that was more appropriate than Europeans just taking everything. So Japan determined that Asia should be its sphere of influence, just like the United States saw itself as protector of the Western Hemisphere. And by the summer of 1941, Japan controlled the entire coast of China, the old French colonies of Indochina, that's like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Japan was also poised to conquer modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia, which the British and the Dutch ruled over. So Japan needed resources to continue to grow, and it was acquiring them at a feverish pace. The West did not like this latecomer in imperialism, and Roosevelt decided that he had to do something. And so he decided to place significant restrictions on the Japanese economy and their supply of war materials, and this put Japan in a corner. Japan is going to sign the Tripartite Pact with Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany soon after this, and the U.S. embargoed trade, froze Japanese assets around the world, and barred shipments of iron and oil to Japan. Now, if that was allowed to continue, then not only would that have stopped Japanese expansion, but it would have caused a severe economic collapse in mainland Japan. Japan really did not want to go to war. So it's not like once this happened, their thought was like, all right, the United States deserves it, let's go attack them. They did think that, but it was more of a practical thing. You don't want to attack the United States because it's an extremely powerful country. So neither side really clamored for war with one another, as far as we can tell, but both kept taking steps that pushed them closer to war. All right, so the decision to attack the United States. From the Japanese perspective, this was a controversial decision. Many Japanese military leaders hoped that they could maintain their empire with a powerful United States right next door. But eventually there was we would say, maybe overconfident group of military leaders who called for an attack to cripple the United States' ability to strike at the Japanese Empire. I'm not going to get too much into the debate. It likely did involve some threats. There was a lot of behind-the-scenes violent shenanigans in Japanese politics at the time. But the important point here is it was a controversial decision. All right, so the Day of Infamy. Now, most Americans knew little or nothing about the escalatory actions being taken by Japan and the United States against one another. Virtually all foreign policy attention was directed at Europe. And so what's going to happen is the Japanese strategy at Pearl Harbor will be mainly aimed at buying themselves time. They believe that the most important thing in naval military strategy is an aircraft carrier. Okay, aircraft carriers are very important because they have much longer range than any other ship. Well, the planes do. So battleships used to be the big thing. You know, battleships, their guns can shoot quite far, but not as far and not as destructive as a sortie of airplanes that are dropping torpedoes and bombs from the sky. So why am I telling you that? Well, for the vast majority of the time, Pearl Harbor had American aircraft carriers there. Now, conveniently, or if you go the conspiratorial route, you know, it was not convenient, it was planned that way. But the all-American carriers were removed from Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is the base in Hawaii. So Japan, the reason they wanted to attack Pearl Harbor was because it was the biggest, most strategically important naval base the United States had in the Pacific Ocean, other than the western coast of the United States. The main target, it wasn't just the base itself, though that was part of the target. It was aircraft carriers. During this time in military history, the aircraft carrier was overwhelmingly the most important type of ship because it had the longest range, it could deliver the most firepower through its planes. You could measure your strength based on carriers. That's not necessarily the case today. Things have changed with missiles, and we won't get into that now, but anyway, it was all about the carriers. So whenever Japan was planning its attack on Pearl Harbor, the main thing was sink the carriers, because there were usually carriers there. But miraculously, or depending on how you think about what was going on at the time, by plan, who knows, most of the evidence points to this being an accident. There were no American carriers there. They had been sent off somewhere else. Now, we also know that the American government knew that war with Japan was likely coming soon. We were intercepting their codes, their coded messages. The United States knew that there was an attack coming. There's a lot of debate on how much we knew, when we knew it, and all that, but we knew there was an attack coming. So on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Americans decoded the last part of a secret message breaking off negotiations in Washington. Japan's ambassador was instructed to deliver a declaration of war immediately before the bombing, but it was 30 minutes late. At 7:30 a.m., December 7th, 1941, 183 Japanese planes flew over the Hawaiian island chain. Those who saw or heard the planes assumed that they were American. As far as those on the base at Pearl Harbor, it was a complete surprise. By the time the second wave of the attack was over, the United States lost 188 planes, 19 ships, including 4 huge battleships, 2,402 Americans killed, and the public was absolutely shocked. Tens of thousands of Americans burst into recruiting centers all around the country. American isolationism, or whatever you want to call it, reluctance to go to war, that was dead. It remains dead to this day. But no carriers were sunk. That was the big thing. So let's talk about the Allied strategy. Even though most Americans saw the Japanese as their primary enemy because of Pearl Harbor, the United Kingdom and the United States agreed that Germany was the bigger priority. And so Germany needed to be dealt with first. So even though the war between the United States and Japan continued with no break, the primary American effort went into defeating Germany first. And Japan was able to take advantage of this and score a series of other victories against the United States in the Pacific Ocean. So the United States was kicked out of the Philippines. Wake Island was taken by the Japanese too. There's other cases as well. The next thing I want to talk about is just how close the world came. Came to what? Well, came to Germany and Japan maybe winning. A lot of people don't realize how there's 5 or 6 things that had they gone a different way, and that could have gone a different way, history would look a lot different than it does now. Now, there's also arguments about it was inevitable that the Allies were going to win, and we'll talk about that later. But let's talk about how close the world came. Now, mid-1942 saw a desperate situation for the Allies. Germany seemed to have the upper hand against the Soviet Union. Germany controlled an area from the Atlantic coast of France all the way to the Volga River, which is deep inside of the Soviet Union. and from the sands of the Sahara Desert in Africa all the way up to the Arctic Circle in Norway. The Atlantic Ocean was infested with U-boats, German U-boats. In the first 6 months of 1942, over 400 Allied ships were sunk. That's a big, expensive deal. The German army seemed invincible. It was by far the premier fighting force in the world, one of the most powerful in world history. So in the Pacific Ocean, things were not any better. American forces were defeated in the Philippines. The Japanese kicked the British out of Southeast Asia. The biggest military defeat in the history of the British Empire was the loss of Singapore to the Japanese. And now the most important part of the British Empire was India, and it was now under threat from the Japanese. Japan took several islands from the United States, like Guam and Wake. It looked good for the Axis and bad for the Allies at that point. Now, here's the question. Was Allied victory inevitable in 1942? And I've got a list of 5 things here. There are many other things you could add to this, but I've got what I think are the 5 most important. Now, even though the land conquered by Germany and Japan was extremely valuable, and even though their armed forces were beating the Allies soundly over and over again, there were some factors that made their position probably unsustainable. One, the United States was rapidly gearing its economy for war. So what I mean is that just like steps that were taken during World War I forced companies to switch over their production to military production, that is going to happen to even a greater extent in World War II, and the amount of military equipment the United States will produce will shock everyone, including the United States. The United States' industrial capacity was exponentially more significant than anyone had imagined possible. It was only a matter of time until the resources of the United States drained Axis power. So that's one big element there. 2, the Soviet Union was still alive. It hadn't surrendered. That in itself was a huge deal, and had managed to save a large chunk of its industrial capacity, which is a crazy story all by itself. So the portion of land that the Soviet Union lost to Nazi Germany was where most of the Soviet Union's factories were. The Soviet Union was able to take apart their factories, put them on trains, and move them further out east to the Ural Mountains or beyond, and put them back together and then continue production. It's a crazy logistical story, but the Soviet Union was able to do it. So the Soviet Union still, despite the millions of soldiers that had already died or been captured, still had a lot of people. And they had a lot of industrial capacity too. The fact that the Soviet Union was still in the fight, and the fact that the Soviet Union had more people than Germany could ever hope to kill, if the USSR could stay in the war long, it would be impossible for Germany to hold on to what it had taken. All right, number 3. Germany and Japan remained isolated from one another, and they didn't really cooperate. They couldn't really cooperate, but they did. Big example, Germany hoped desperately that Japan would invade the Soviet Union from the other side. In Siberia. Japan, it was not in Japan's interest to do that. They had their own problems, and so they wouldn't really coordinate their actions, whereas the Allies were coordinating to a much greater extent. Even the Soviet Union and the United States that had obvious reasons to dislike one another. Number 4, racist and inhumane occupation policies made the occupation much more difficult for both Germany and Japan. Germany had many opportunities to enlist the support of local populations. So that may sound crazy, but whether you're talking about the Ukraine, which, Germans in many cases in parts of the Ukraine were welcomed as liberators and heroes, the Baltic states like Lithuania, Estonia, had Germany's occupation policies been different, it may have been much easier for them to occupy very large spaces without using so many resources to keep resistance suppressed. That's not true everywhere, but Germany's racist policies were so arrogant that basically someone would come to them and say, hey, I'll support you, and then they're just like, hey, forget you, we don't care. You're inferior, leave us alone. So squandered opportunity. And of course Japan, they were committing atrocities left and right themselves, which of course makes people more desperate to not cooperate with you. All right, number 5, Hitler's increasing interference with military decisions, despite his decreasing mental abilities. This resulted in self-inflicted damage to German armed forces. A lot of people may not realize, Hitler very likely had Parkinson's. You can tell if you look at footage of him, especially late in the war. And we also have a lot of notes from his personal doctor. Hitler was on a drug cocktail, an experimental drug cocktail, in order to keep his Parkinson's down, and maybe for other reasons we don't know. But the reason that that's relevant is that Hitler had always intervened in military decisions. And believe it or not, early on in the war, it actually helped the German military. And like the invasion of France, I mean, Hitler would make unilateral decisions that went against what most of his generals wanted. And then to his general's shock, it was like, oh my God, I can't believe how well that worked. That is definitely not the case towards 1942 and beyond. Whether you're talking about Stalingrad, whether you're talking about not allowing for strategic withdrawals in many places on the Eastern Front in particular, whether you're talking about reacting to what was going on D-Day later or with the Allied invasion of Normandy. There were many, many examples of Hitler making very obviously bad decisions that absolutely quickened Germany's defeat. And some would argue that more than just quickened Germany's defeat, made Germany's defeat inevitable. The turning points in the war, there's a lot of major battles that are talked about, but specifically the turning points, like a sign that things are going in a different direction. These happened in 1942. And some Stalingrad, 1942 and 1943. Though there were turning points before 1942, like the Battle of Britain, there are three turning points in 1942 that clearly signaled the decline of the Axis powers. El Alamein, Stalingrad, and Midway. El Alamein was in northern Africa, in Egypt. There was a battle going on between Germany and Italy on one side, and primarily Britain, later the United States. France and some other allies were helping as well. Germany was threatening to take the Suez Canal, which was massively important to the British war effort and very important to naval superiority in the Mediterranean Sea as well. And Germany was close, and proximity-wise they were close, but the Battle of El Alamein shattered any chance for the Germans to win and take the Suez Canal. And so that's why it's a huge turning point. Stalingrad is another huge turning point, even though there's a lot of people who believe that after the initial failure to capture Moscow in 1941, it was impossible for the Germans to win there. Stalingrad was very obviously a turning point for the scale of the destruction of the German army. The German side lost an entire army. Well, really more than an army. It was the Sixth Army and then, bits and remnants of other armies that had been encircled. But you're talking hundreds of thousands of POWs. The German army was never able to really recover. It was downhill for Germany from that point forward. The third one is Midway. This is in the Pacific. Midway was an island, believe it or not, about midway between the United States and Asia. It's very significant because this is where 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Remember, carriers are the most important part of naval warfare during this time. I encourage you to look into more details, but those are the 3 big turning points in 1942. So another big element of World War II that doesn't get talked about quite as much because the Allies won was strategic bombing and the justification for strategic bombing. Part of the strategy was for the Allies taking large bombers and dropping bombs on cities, not just to bomb military production either. It was also to just bomb people. Again, because this war was potentially an existential threat for democracies around the world, those democracies were more likely to justify intentionally killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. In Germany, 410,000 Germans, maybe more, died as a result of bombing. 330,000 Japanese civilians died. Again, typically the United States tries to avoid civilian casualties, and they're morally controversial if a government intentionally kills civilians. But in World War II, that was not the case. Again, because of the scale of the war and the fear that, hey, if we lose this war, then we may be, murdered by the Germans, enslaved. The scale was so much bigger. Let's talk about financing the war. People forget that wars cost a ton of money. Countries cannot fight if they go broke. The biggest invention or discovery of the war, which completely changed the nature of foreign relations and warfare ever since, was the atomic bomb. So the Manhattan Project, which employed over 100,000 people, it resulted in the atomic bomb. About $2 billion was spent on that, which, today that'd be a joke. It's not a lot at all, but for them that was a huge effort. So national and racial paranoia at home. So even though there were some laws that limited the freedoms of Italians and Germans in the United States who were not citizens. German and Italian Americans avoided any significant government-condoned discrimination. Now, the Japanese would not be so lucky. Japanese Americans and immigrants alike were put into concentration camps in the United States. The U.S. general responsible for defending the American West once said, quote, "A Jap's a Jap, no matter if they are American citizens or not," end quote. So this goes to show you, in times of war, ideals, the Constitution, these types of things can go away. And that was not even seen as controversial at the time. Racism against the Japanese was widespread throughout the U.S., especially because of Pearl Harbor. If Japanese Americans refused to report for relocation, they were arrested, and the living conditions in those concentration camps were very poor. Despite many being veterans, blacks and Hispanics continued to suffer violence and discrimination from white America. There were race riots in Detroit. There was the Zoot Suit controversy in Southern California. So winning the war. World War II, largest war in world history. Hopefully it stays that way. When the United States gets involved, like I said, the priority will be Germany first. The United States will get involved in North Africa, help eventually kick German forces out of North Africa, then invade Italy, kick Italy out of the war, where Italy, again, they're the side switcher, they switch sides. Then the big thing is invading France, so that's D-Day. The United States will be involved, really the main partner in invading France. But even though the American contribution to beating Germany was immense, no country comes even close to what the Soviet Union did. The real battle, or the real war within the war in World War II, was the fight between Germany and the Soviet Union. Millions of soldiers on both sides trying to literally exterminate the other. Germany didn't want to just simply conquer and then rule. They wanted to depopulate and colonize. They wanted to enslave Russians or Ukrainians or whoever that lived in that territory. They wanted to set up plantations and things like that for Germans to move over. The scale of death and suffering from that war doesn't diminish individual suffering anywhere. You know, a death is a death, a murder is a murder. But the scale of the Eastern Front of World War II dwarfs everything else. So the biggest reason that Germany lost World War II, the Soviet Union. So as the war closed, the Allies had to decide what's going to happen to Europe after the war. We'll talk more about that when we cover the Cold War. Okay, so let's talk about the Holocaust. Nazism was built on racial idealism. And at first, people considered by the Germans to be undesirable, were threatened, discriminated against, and told to leave the country. And many did. But it was impossible and impractical for millions in Germany to just immediately leave. Plus, nobody had any idea that eventually Germany would try to gas millions of people. Again, hindsight. Always be careful with hindsight. A lot of times people say, like, well, I would have left if I was a Jew and I saw what was going on. Nobody saw the extermination of more than 6 million people coming. It was unfathomable. Now, when everything was going well for the Nazi German Empire, Jews were not killed by the government en masse as like government policy. Certainly there was intense racism towards Jews. Certainly Jews were killed and were victims quite often of public violence, pogroms, destruction of property. Jews were absolutely terrorized by the Nazi government. But what I'm trying to distinguish here is when we talk about the Holocaust, when we talk about death camps, when we talk about bodies being processed in ovens on a massive scale, that did not start until certain changes happened in World War II, on the Eastern Front in particular. But the planned extermination of Jews did not become a government policy until mid-1941 after Nazi Germany invaded Soviet Russia. Now, at first, the plan was special police battalions and hunter groups were set up to shoot as many Jews and communists and anyone else who was considered undesirable as possible. As the invasion of the Soviet Union progressed, there were squads of German police units whose job it was to commit murder based on race or politics or any other possible reason that the German government decided. These are known as Einsatzgruppen. I can put the word in the description for spelling purposes. But soon this tactic became impractical. It became impractical because the scale was very large. There were severe psychological side effects of this type of inhumane policy. The people who were being tasked with this mass murder were, believe it or not, what we would consider regular people. In fact, one of the most important works ever done on the Holocaust, a book by Christopher Browning, Ordinary Men, basically makes the argument that these were normal Germans who were not hardcore Nazis, who were not really screened for any sort of like special skills or attributes that would make them more efficient or more okay with the idea of murdering people at point blank range. And so as a result, you're going to have a lot of suicides in these police battalions. You're going to have refusing to do the work, but most will comply. And again, there's a very important historical lesson in that. You could simply write it off and say, well, Germans are bad, or only evil people did that. There's a much more important lesson about human nature, which we'll get to in just a little bit. So once this policy of murdering at close range became impractical, this is when the idea of death camps came about. You're talking December 1941, and that's actually when the Wehrmacht, the German army, suffered its first major setback, failing to capture Moscow, and then a big counterattack that resulted in many, many German deaths. So this is going to lead to a supply shock. There's going to be a lot of supply shortages. Once that occurred, the result was a drastic plan. And this is where we get the phrase, quote, the final solution to the Jewish question, end quote. The amount of people that Germany was responsible for, whether it be Jews that were forcibly relocated into ghettos, whether it be POWs from all the armies that the Germans had defeated, whether it be the German army themselves, there simply were not enough resources to sustain everyone. So death camps, extermination as policy, mass extermination as policy, is going to be put in place in this context. So this involved the concentration of Jews and other ethnic social groups considered to be undesirable, whether you're talking about homosexuals, communists, the handicapped, social outsiders. We're talking about industrialized extermination. Between 11 and 15 million people were killed this way. Now, I mentioned earlier Christopher Browning. He's an author of the very, very important work, Ordinary Men, the story of Police Battalion 101, I believe. It's a story of German men who usually did not qualify for regular army service, and so they were put in police battalions, which were traditionally used for just garrisoning an occupied territory, basically policing new subjects. Well, in this particular case, they were given the very gruesome assignment of mass murder. Again, this is before the death camps. This is going out into a neighborhood, rounding up people with the information that they had available, and taking them out into a field, executing them, putting them in a mass grave over and over and over again. And so obviously there's a psychological toll for such a thing. And the book mentions something called the Milgram Experiment, which I'm going to post a link to so that you can sort of see it. And the Milgram Experiment is actually something that happened in the United States. And the purpose of this was to test the limits of obedience. In other words, it set up 3 people were part of this experiment. Only one person was unaware of the parameters of this experiment. The other 2 were actors. And so there was an experimenter who was in charge of the session, a teacher who was a volunteer for a single session, and the teachers were led to believe that they were assisting in another experiment, but they were actually the subjects of the experiment. So the experimenter, again, like the guy in a lab coat who was running the session, he's in the same room as the teacher. The teacher is the poor fool who doesn't know what's going on. And the learner is in another room. You can't see them, but you're told that they're hooked up to an electric current, and when they get an incorrect answer, it's your job to shock them. And there's a scale that goes all the way up to where there's like a red X. And it pretty much implies on the scale that, you could very likely be delivering a fatal amount of electricity to this person. So what's the point of that? Well, they wanted to see, and again, they didn't pick hardcore psychos or anything. They picked men, women of different attitudes, different political backgrounds. It didn't really matter. At a certain point, the actor who was supposedly hooked up, and you could hear the actor, by the teacher could hear the learner or the actor in the other room. So they would scream and say, like, please don't do that, this is hurting me. And then eventually at a certain point where the teacher pushed a certain level of electricity, then the learner would just stop making noise altogether, as if they had passed out or deceased or who knows. So the results, and I'm just going to give you, just for clarity and convenience sake, I'm going to give you a rundown from Wikipedia. In Milgram's first set of experiments, 65%, that is 26 of the 40 who were tested, administered the experiment's final massive 450 volt shock. So that means they kept doing it after the person was screaming for them to stop, after it indicated that this was potentially fatal, very dangerous. They kept going. Now, some context. None of them went through it without being stressed out. All of them were uncomfortable, visibly. Some of them were crying. Some of them were, I think a couple even had a panic attack, the ones who went all the way through. So it's not like we're talking about sociopaths. Why did they continue to go then if they weren't comfortable? Well, here's what the experimenter would do, the guy in the lab coat. If the person who was the teacher said, I don't want to keep going, then the experimenter would say, please continue. And then, sometimes that wouldn't work. Then if they continued to protest, they would say, the experiment requires that you continue. And that would work on some more. And then some would, they would still complain and say, like, I really don't feel good about this. I think that person's really hurt. So then the experimenter would say, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And yet again, that would work. That would be another layer of people saying, okay. And then the last one, they would say to the person, so let's say all of those things were said, the person is in there screaming, they're passed out, and they say, hit the button again. They got another wrong answer. Press the button. Then, and if they said, no, I don't want to, the last thing they would say is, you have no other choice, you must go on. And that is the one that really, for the majority of everyone, of Americans, they would continue to go and deliver that final, likely fatal shock, even after the person had stopped screaming and presumably was passed out, or who knows. Now, what does that have to do with the Holocaust? Well, the whole point of Christopher Browning's book, his thesis, was that obedience, going with authority, had more to do with people deciding to kill others than hatred of Jews or racism or any sort of indoctrination. Part of this study wasn't just using the Milgram experiment, it was actual interviews with these people afterwards, which of course, those are problematic for obvious reasons. But anyway, it's worth looking into because it says something very important about human nature. And so if there's a normal person who isn't aware of the Milgram experiment, then they may just assume that I would never do anything like that to another person. That, of course, that's ridiculous. It's all you're hearing is you're being able to see other people do it. You have hindsight. There's no reason to think that 26 of those 40 people would have predicted that they would have gone in there and killed someone that day just if they had been told that they had to do it. So there's a very important lesson there. Anyway, I'll link you to the book and some information about the book. Okay, so to finish off World War II, the biggest element of the German portion of this war was the Soviet Union versus Germany, which started in 1941. The Soviet Union eventually recovered despite massive casualties. I mean, tens of millions of casualties. And then eventually were the ones that captured Berlin, which is the capital of Germany. And that happened in 1945. Now, of course, the United States of America, Britain, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and a lot of other countries that deserve to be mentioned that I'm not going to say all of them. France also fought and had lots and lots and lots of soldiers die and made a huge sacrifice. So I'm not trying to belittle that, but again, the biggest responsibility for defeating the Nazi Empire in terms of sacrifice, in terms of Germans killed, in terms of importance to Germany finally having an unconditional surrender, was the Soviet Union. Hitler eventually commits suicide, Germany will surrender. But Japan, remember them, they're still hanging on. After the Battle of Midway, which I told you about, which was in 1942, the United States never lost the initiative. Or in other words, Japan never really had a chance to win. It was just a matter of time. The Japanese had a socio-religious doctrine that was related to warfare, and specifically to like the warrior code known as Bushido. The salient point there is that you were not supposed to surrender. That it was like a religious moral importance that you die in battle. The Pacific Ocean being the battleground, you're talking about a series of islands. So an amphibious invasion is quite a deadly endeavor. An amphibious invasion is taking soldiers and equipment from the sea on ships and landing it on a beach and then moving inland. Well, there was a nonstop stream of island hopping, which is what it was called. So it's very deadly. Just to give you an idea, American casualties on Iwo Jima, which is one of the last but major battles of the war against Japan, there were 6,821 Marines killed, 19,217 wounded. So that's a tremendous amount of casualties for one very small island. Now, to put it in perspective, the Bushido, which you did not surrender, the Japanese had 21,844 killed and 216 captured. So those are not numbers that you see in military history. This is a virtually unique scenario. Now, Okinawa, another battle, 12,513 American Marines killed, 38,916 wounded. Massive casualties. Japan, 95,000 killed, approximately, about 9,000 captured. About 100,000 civilians died as a result of this battle, too. The last remaining topic is about the very end of the war, which is the only time a nuclear weapon has ever been used, and it was used twice by the United States. And so, of course, there's a big debate about whether it was necessary. There's a big mix of what we know and what we don't know. I'm not instructing anyone to have a certain opinion. I can declare my bias. For a long time, even after I had a bachelor's degree in history, I believed that it was necessary and it saved hundreds of thousands of American lives and probably saved Japanese lives as well. I had that opinion for a long time. After grad school, digging a little deeper, my personal experience was I changed my mind. I thought that it wasn't necessary. Now, again, I'm not even approaching the moral aspect. I'm not saying whether it was right or wrong. I don't get into that business. What I'm specifically talking about is whether or not it was necessary to compel Japan to surrender. There are many other factors involved that have since changed my mind. The importance of the Soviet Union invading finally Manchuria to declare war on Japan and remove Japan from Manchuria. That was a very, very important factor. Whether it was, how much more time would Japan have waited to surrender? Do we know that they just wouldn't have, no matter what? And of course, there's ideas about like how important it was for the United States politically to demonstrate the power that it had, that, it wouldn't really have a huge strategic advantage by being the only country in the world to have a nuclear bomb if nobody knew, one, that it existed, and two, what it could do. It's a debate. You're not required to have one opinion or another in my class. In terms of numbers of people who died, at least initially, again, the consequences of those nuclear weapons lingered on far after that. But the use of the bomb in Hiroshima, there were 80,000 killed. Nagasaki was 60,000 killed. And then Japan surrendered on September 3rd, 1945.